Randy Forbes, who has been re-elected by the people of the Virginia's 4th Congressional District 6 times. He serves on the House Judiciary Committee. He is chairman and founder of the Congressional China Caucus, and most relevant to today's gathering, he's a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee and chair of its Seapower Projection Forces Subcommittee. All who care about the safety of America know Congressman Forbes is a leading national security expert and a central figure in ongoing debates about defense doctrine, the defense budget, and the military procurement process. Most critically, Congressman Forbes has been one of the very few voices in Washington systematically warning about the national security implications of an American retreat from unquestioned dominance in the world seas. Relying on the facts and marshaling them into a powerful argument in Congress and to the public, there is perhaps no better person in Washington to provide insight on the subject of today's panel discussion, the timely new book by my friend and Hudson Senior Fellow Seth Cropsey, Mayday, The Decline of American Naval Supremacy. Seeing Congressman Forbes here today reminds some of us of the words of President John F. Kennedy speaking to the nation and to future generations from aboard the USS Kitty Hawk 50 years ago, when he said, "Events of October 1962 indicated, as has all of history, that control of the sea means security. Control of the seas can mean peace. Control of the seas can mean victory. The United States must control the seas if it is to protect your security." Please join me in welcoming Congressman Randy Forbes.
Thank you, John, and I want to thank the Hudson Institute for doing this today. And Seth, thank you for writing this book. I have not completed it yet. My staff has, but I look forward to doing that, and I think they're going to twist your arm to sign one of those copies for me to keep as I look forward to reading it. But I want to also thank all of you, and this is more than fluff. You know, most of the time we go someplace to speak, we start out by saying thank you for what you're doing and to be here. But I sincerely say that to all of you in here for two reasons. One, I am excited because I see a growing willingness to start doing strategic thinking and planning, not in the Pentagon and not over in Congress, but among writers and thinkers in the general public. And it has never perhaps been a more crucial time than we have today. But I see two things happening. I see, first of all, I see individuals start to realize the importance of us doing strategic planning and strategic thinking, and it's a lost art up here. I've often said when I first got to Congress, I used to bemoan the fact that we would only have 6-month planning. Now I pray that we have 6-month planning, because we oftentimes are just shooting from the hip and we're reacting. And so I appreciate the analysis that I'm seeing from writers and thinkers about national defense issues, and especially when it comes to our maritime fleet and our Navy. But the second thing that I'm seeing is there's a growing group of writers who are writing in a way that I think is beginning to shift and be a little bit different, and it is this. It is easy for us sometimes to get down into the weeds and the analysis, but what we have got to do nationwide is to change the curve lines. We've got to change how the public looks at these issues. We've got to change how policymakers look at these issues. And oftentimes when we dive into the weeds, what happens is I watch their faces and we lose them. Normally, it only takes about 11 seconds to lose a policymaker over in Congress. And the unfortunate thing is the general public, sometimes we lose them in less time than that. But what I'm seeing now is a greater degree of clarity to, one, go down in the weeds, but then to come up and say, here are the bullet points. These are the messages that we need to be driving together. And I think that's a crucial thing for us to do. We have got to be able to not just talk about the size of our fleet and our weapons platforms and those kind of things, but we've got to be able to convince a public of the importance of the Navy and what we need to be doing with national defense. And we've got to be able to explain it to policymakers, many of whom know very, very little about these issues until they get on the floor and start voting on particular things. And we also have to find a way of painting pictures to them. And that's what I want to offer to you today. And forgive me for doing this analogy, but it's just one that I think we need to be changing the whole debate line on where we are with some of these curves. And I want you to think not today about aircraft carriers or destroyers or submarines, but I want you to think about a bridge in Minnesota. Many of you remember in 2007 we had the I-35 West Mississippi River Bridge in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That collapsed. And when that bridge collapsed, 13 people lost their lives, 145 people were injured. Now, I want you to think about that bridge because that bridge was built in 1967, and 40 years later, it collapsed. Had you or I or any engineering team walked out the day before and looked at that bridge, we would not have seen cracks in the concrete. You wouldn't have looked and said, well, the shoulders don't look very good. You wouldn't have said the trusses don't look very good. And yet, that bridge, which was originally designed to carry at maximum 60,000 cars a day, was carrying 144,000 cars. They had done repairs to that bridge and actually tried to update some of the concrete and stuff that was on it. And yet what really happened was the gusset plates, a little half-inch piece of metal that unites the various trusses and all coming together, 13 of those gusset plates exploded and broke. Just half-inch piece of metal. And nobody would have predicted it before, but the result was 13 deaths, 145 people injured. Now, I want you to then imagine that has happened, and that bridge was built back in a phenomenal fashion. It was 444 days, I think, somewhere maybe 414 days, somewhere around that, but just over a year we built a new bridge back. But imagine the hearing that would take place after that bridge collapsed. And I want you to be the engineering team coming before an imaginary group of legislators and policymakers, and they simply look at the engineering team and say, have you designed this bridge back so we can reconstruct it? And will it carry not only the 144,000 people we got to carry a day, but the projected amount of traffic that you've got in the future? And imagine the lead engineering responding this way. Well, Mr. Chairman, we have designed this, but we realize that there are budget problems across the state and across the country, and we have to take our share of those budget cuts. So we have had to reduce the design on this bridge, and in so doing, we recognize that there are risks that we have to take, but we think those are acceptable risks. I think the chairman of that committee would look at him and say, what are you talking about? I want to know, will it hold 144,000 cars that are going across the bridge today? And will it hold the projected needs that we have? And then he responds this way. Well, Mr. Chairman, you need to realize that it's not just about this bridge. It's a holistic approach that we have to take to transportation needs today. And we have another bridge that's 5 miles down the road that will carry some of this traffic. And that bridge we hope to rebuild at some time in the future. So it will help take some of this 144,000 cars that are going and perhaps take over some of the load in the future. And then the chairman says, well, Mr. Chief Engineer, will you show me your plans for how you're going to get that done? And he pulls out a piece of paper and he says, okay, on the second bridge that's down there, here's what we plan to do. We plan to tear that bridge down and get rid of the bridge because the cost of operating that bridge is a little too expensive for us today, and that will help us put some dollars and cents on this bridge, and we're going to do that over the next 5 years. And then we're going to build a new bridge that's going to be down there that's going to help with our transportation. And the chairman then says, well, Mr. Chief Engineer, when are you going to build the new bridge? And he says, 30 years from today, we're going to build our new bridge. And then the chairman says, where are you going to get the money to build the new bridge? And he says, don't have a clue. But I want you to walk away confident that we have a holistic system and we have a plan and process to do this. Now, the reason I tell you that is because you know those guys would have gone crazy over that situation. They'd say the public needs a bridge they can drive over now. They need to know it's safe. They need to know it's not going to collapse. And let me tell you, as I sit through hearing after hearing after hearing when it talks about the Navy, that's exactly the responses you know we're getting. I'm sitting there and just looking at these statistics. I mean, you know, any one statistic you can take out of context, but they do form a tapestry that we start looking at. One of the things that I know is in 2007, my combatant commanders around the globe, we were able to meet, the Navy was able to meet about 90% of their needs, their requirements. This year, we'll meet about 51% of those needs. That's a problem. That's a problem we sit back and look at. The second thing is when I look at the number of ships that we're getting, almost any independent analysis comes up that we need more than what we have today. You pick how many we have today, 283, 284, 285, 286, depending on the mood the Navy's in today. But you know also that they've told us we need to go to 306. Almost any independent analysis would tell us we need more ships than that. But even if you take what they've given us and you look at their plan, by their own words, is a fantasy world, and they will tell you two things. One, the first thing we're going to do is decommission a lot of ships and take them out in the early part, tearing down that other bridge. And then they're going to say this, we're going to build the other ships, but most of them don't get built until the out years, which could be as far as 2037. And then you ask this question, which seems to be the most simplistic of all of them. You say, as I look at your numbers, there is a $4 billion shortfall every year for the next 30 years on how you're going to build these ships. That's a fantasy world. Do you have any inclination, any piece of paper, any oral statement, anything that would suggest where you're going to get this money? And their response, as you've probably heard in the hearing, no. And you step back and you say, how are we selling this to a general public? But let me tell you what's even more frustrating. I want you to imagine on that bridge scenario that I just gave you, suppose they brought that to the state legislature. They get on the floor with the bridge as being built, knowing they're going to need to tear down the other bridge, knowing they won't build that bridge for 30 years. And then all of a sudden you get some young legislators that come on the floor and say, we want to reduce the funding that you're doing on this bridge. And you say, why do you want to do that? And they say, well, because there are bridges in other states that are being built cheaper, and we think we can cut the price of this without doing any analysis, any engineering, any looking at it at all. And that's what we're facing every single day. When we walk to the floor and we find people coming out and cutting national defense programs, and it's okay to have a dispute, but to walk on the floor and say, oh, we just think because other countries are doing it cheaper, we can do it. That is leading us, I think, into policy directions that we should be frightful about traveling down that road. And so the thing that I'm excited about with this book, it gives you facts. It raises questions that we can begin to analyze. But I'm also excited that you're beginning to do that. And let me just lead you with today in saying this. I really believe the last decade was the decade that we asked a disproportionate service from our Army and our Marine Corps. They stepped up to the plate and they delivered that. I firmly believe, without picking favorites, that as we look over the next decade, 2 decades, maybe even 3 decades, it's going to be a decade that we will determine our national defense in large measure based upon our seapower and our projection forces. And as you know, seapower is bigger than just the Navy. That's why it is absolutely crucial that we do the analysis, that we put the facts on the table, and we walk away saying this: not just how much do we want to afford to spend on our national defense, but what's the risk to the United States of America if we don't supply those resources? That's a debate that needs to change in Washington. It needs to change across America. And I just thank all of you for being a part of that debate and for allowing me to be here with you today. So with that, Seth, thanks for your good work. And oh, sure. Seth has said I had a couple of minutes for some questions. Is that what you were saying? Yeah. Any comments or questions about things you think we should be looking at or how we should do it? Yes, sir.
Congressman, I have a question for Seapower Magazine. You've made this pitch repeatedly, and your own committee passed an authorization bill that goes pretty much along with the Navy shipbuilding plan, which you acknowledge is insufficient. When is Congress going to come up with the money that they need to do what you want?
I think a couple things. First of all, excellent question. Secondly, I think that we are beginning to lay the groundwork to make those changes. And I've told everybody, we love to be in an instant pudding world. We love to be able to walk in and say, I make one speech or I do one thing, and all of a sudden everybody in Congress says, oh yeah, we see that, and the light turns on and they change. That really doesn't happen. And we've said all along, this is going to take not just several days or weeks or months, but several years to change, one, the way policymakers think, and also the way the public thinks. The exciting thing is on that Seapower subcommittee and also the full committee, We beat back any amendments that would try to change that. When people put on the floor, we were far more organized this time than we've ever been. I think people understand that. We're beating back those arguments each time they come. But here's what the exciting thing is, and the way I think we need to change it. We need to educate policymakers on this analysis and the strategic thinking. And historically what's happened is this. You'll get some really good people, but when they come to the floor and vote on these issues, as you guys know, on some of the amendments, you have 10 minutes on an amendment. And the way most of these were working is both conferences, you take the Republican or Democratic conference, but when you bring something as large as the National Defense Authorization Bill, the chairman of the committee gets about 60 seconds. I mean, maybe on a good day, 3 minutes to explain to the conference this is the National Defense Authorization Bill and why it's important. You got guys bringing amendments that sometimes sound good, but you have 10, remember that 10 minutes, 5 minutes is for the amendment, 5 minutes against the amendment. You can't possibly explain that. So what we're trying to do is a couple of things. One, we are starting something we just call, for lack of better phraseology, a defense dialogue where we're circulating members of Congress through our office when we have meetings off the record with thinkers, writers, generals, admirals, and these are people not on the Armed Services Committee to talk about some of this strategic thinking and hoping that works out in the general group of members in Congress. Second thing, though, is we're pushing our leadership to have special conferences that would not just be an hour-long conference where you talk about everything, but 2- and 3-hour conferences that would be mandatory where people have to come. You have the chairman, subcommittee members saying, this is why we're doing this. This is how this works together. This is the important part of it. So just realize if you try to tear a piece of this down, what you're doing. If people have done that strategic thinking and analysis and then walk out and disagree, that's okay. But at least, for goodness sake, when we're talking about national defense of the country, let's have that debate and dialogue. The other thing and final thing that we're trying to do now is we're trying to get defense contractors, we're trying to get members in uniform, retired individuals, writers and thinkers to come together and to say, okay, we're all writing about, thinking about different things, but what are the top 4 or 5 message points that we really need to give the public to think about, to paint that picture? And that is not going to happen in 6 weeks, but I think it's starting to happen. And a lot of you have been a part of that. You had a question.
I'm sorry. John Utley with the American Conservative magazine. To carry a bridge analysis, let's assume that in today's world, the parts from the bridge had to come from 44 states in key congressional districts, that the bridge was costing, let's compare the F-16, I believe, was $20 million. The F-35 is $300 million. Largely because parts are put in 44 states in key congressional districts. We have now in the Navy, I believe, 1 admiral for every ship. Vastly, the military pay system has gone so high that even the Pentagon tries to say we can't pay our men so much, it interferes with other areas. Nothing you have addressed is about all the incredible waste that's going on in the military, not to mention a strategy which is in many ways is designed to refight World War II. We have 7,000 tanks. The Army doesn't want more of the Abrams. We still keep making them because it's a key congressional district in Ohio. I wish you'd address some of the waste that goes on, that this bridge you mentioned is now costing 5 times as much, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, let me do that.
You haven't done anything about where the money can be saved, rather than saying, you have to spend every nickel or the bridge will crash and people will die.
First of all, I didn't say that. And secondly, let me just say this. I had about 10 minutes when I came in here. If I had a little longer, I'd be glad to take all those issues, but let me cover them while you raise them. First thing is I can't stop all the selfishness in the world. I can't stop either the people that come in and let's just say cut everything without doing any analysis and asking what the risk of the United States of America is before they do it. And I've got equal number of people that come up to the plate and do that. Very few people that I know say we have to spend every dollar, it's going to collapse. What they say is, and what we've always said, is you got to do the analysis. And the analysis for national defense is 4 basic questions. The first question is this: what's the true threat to the United States of America? You know, as we look at that threat and we lay that out both short term and in the near future or foreseeable future. Second thing is, what do our combatant commanders need to be able to supply the resources necessary to do the missions to protect us from that threat? Third thing that's vitally important is how do we get them to those combatant commanders in the most efficient and economical means possible. And then the fourth one is two components. What can we afford to spend? Fair question. But the second corollary to that is, what's the risk to the United States if we don't supply it? And what I've been saying all along is, just ask those four questions, put them on the table, and then at least give the American people a fair question. Now, when I come back to your part about cost cutting, there are three big cancers right now that are, I think, destroying national defense. One of those is these arbitrary cuts where people are just walking in and saying, I just want to cut across the board without doing any analysis. I think that's wrong. And I can walk down how I think it's wrong. Second thing that I think is important is our procurement process, which is a part of the waste that you're talking about. It is just inconceivable when you have to do 40 different approvals to get a platform out, which literally is what we have to do, 40 approvals sometimes, because you talk about raising the cost because of each of those selfish members of Congress who want things in their particular areas. When you get 40 different approvals, the people in those particular departments are going to want to add things on to a cost of something, which raises it through the roof. But it's not just the dollar cost, it's the time cost. We literally have some weapon systems that take us 22 years to get deployed because of having to go through all those approvals. And then the third thing is, there's no question we've got to look at a benefits package system for our military, not just to say do we cut dollars and cents out of it, but do we have the right mix of what's really creating the incentives that we need. I'm fair game with putting all of that on the table. What I'm saying the danger is not doing the analysis, not doing the factual discussion, and that's where I think we have fallen short over the last several years. Okay, I'm getting the hook now. Thank you guys so much for letting me be with you.
I'd also like to thank Congressman Forbes for an excellent presentation, and no less for what is extremely seriously needed in this country, which is leadership on this subject. The Congressman is providing that leadership, and I hope all of us are very grateful to him for it, and particularly grateful that he can make it here today.
Thank you all so much.
Come on over here.
Thank you, guys.
Mic working? I'm Seth Cropsey. I'll say a couple of words in a moment, but I'd like to introduce our panelists here today. First, I'll say a couple of words about each of them, and then turn the floor over to them after I make a couple of remarks myself. Directly closest to me here is Rear Admiral Marfiak, who was a graduate of the Naval Academy some years ago, with honors in languages and humanities. He's served a distinguished career in surface ships prior to commanding, by coincidence, the USS Kitty Hawk, which John Walters mentioned in his introduction of Congressman Forbes. In Washington, Admiral Marfiak's assignments have ranged from officer detailing, that's assigning officers to where they're going next, to special assistant to the Secretary of Defense, to Director of Surface Warfare Plans and Programs, and Commandant of the National War College. I should also point out that Admiral Marfiak is an Olmsted Scholar, a Navy program, very good and successful one, and graduated from the Institut d'études politiques in Paris with a master's degree in international relations, international law and diplomacy. He has also attended the Fletcher School of Law at Tufts, where he earned a master's degree in law and diplomacy, and also the executive seminar at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Next after him is Brian McGrath, who is also a retired naval officer. Spent 21 years on active duty, including tour in command of USS Bulkley, a guided missile destroyer, home ported in Norfolk in Virginia. Brian is also founding managing director of the Ferry Bridge Group, which is a niche consultancy that specializes in naval and national security issues, including national and military strategy, strategic planning, executive communications, and emerging technologies. Next, oh, I did that wrong. That's Brian with the bow tie, and then Paul is the other guy with the bow tie. In this case, the red one. Paul is president of Global Strategies and Transformation, which is also involved in strategic planning. During his time in the Navy, he was a naval aviator, a naval strategic planner, a political military strategic planner for the Far East, South Asia, and Pacific. He managed the U.S.-Japan alliance in the Secretary of Defense's office and is a graduate of Harvard's last Navy ROTC Reserve Officer Training Corps Commission class, the U.S. Naval War College, and the National War College equivalent, National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo. So our guests have now been introduced. They will speak 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. I would like to thank you very briefly for joining us today in what I anticipate is the first event of Hudson Center for American Seapower. We've already had the benefit of Representative Forbes' insights, and now we're going to listen to the panel. The book, which is the subject of this afternoon's discussion, expresses my thoughts as best as I was able to. Very briefly, in a word, for those of you who are absolutely excused for not having read it yet, but would not be for not buying it. I believe that the United States is suited by geography, by its genius for commerce, and our interest in a secure national, international order to dominance at sea. Our economic growth from a poor country to the world's most prosperous one parallels American sea power's development from a handful of frigates to the world's greatest naval power. This power is being challenged today by China, by Russia's plans to return to the Eastern Mediterranean, and more ambitious plans to reestablish itself as a Pacific naval power. It's being challenged by technology, as missiles that can destroy or severely harm ships increase their power, range, and availability, but nowhere more than by our own virtual naval disarmament, as fleet size and resources to replenish aging sea power continue to diminish. If carried to its regrettable but predictable conclusion, the U.S. will lose its naval dominance within less than 30 years. This will end America's run as the world's great power. Athenian and Venetian experience in the Mediterranean tell the same story. Their lives as great powers concluded with the loss of their naval supremacy. Britain and Holland's experience recapitulates at a world level what had been proven in the Mediterranean. Sea power is key to the international order that U.S. diplomacy, arms, and the wars it fought in the 20th century sought to establish. This order respects the rights of free passage through international waters. Its presence stands for human rights, for liberty, and allows us to influence events to the benefit of our interests for the same. It allows us to protect allies and friends and demonstrates repeatedly that we are a power with effective global reach. It anchors us as a great power. If we surrender it, we can anticipate a different international order, from alliances to navigation to the respect we once commanded, in brief, to the kind of world we live in. Panelists we are fortunate to have with us today will have their say on these and other related issues, and it's time for me to turn the floor over to them. Admiral Marfiat.
Thanks, Seth. Good afternoon. I want to thank Seth for inviting me today to speak with you, and particularly Representative Forbes for setting the stage so beautifully in terms of the strategic dialogue. I think one of the most valuable aspects of this book is that it should cause us to think about the strategic environment. We do not do that. We live in a world in which the media moment is driven by a banner that crosses the television and says breaking news. Right? What's happened to the most recent starlet to fall afoul of the legal system? What's happening at some 10 reasons why we should have better nutrition. We do not look at the strategic overview, and we rarely consider the long-term implications. And yet for those of us who, as the phrase goes, have worn the cloth, these are abiding issues of great importance. From a user's perspective, let me give you a couple of ideas to consider as you read the book. First of all, mastery of the seas is not something that one learns overnight. It is a long-term process. It requires being there. You just do not arrive off the coast of an unknown continent or an unknown country and instantaneously know everything about the environment, the geopolitics, or the operating arena. It takes being there. That means forward presence. It means we have to operate our ships in those vicinities and those areas where we need to be in order to support the United States policies with respect to those countries. We cannot just arrive someplace and say, hello, we're here. Everybody will now pay attention. We found that in the Gulf in 1990, and we found that in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Mediterranean, where we had to learn again all of the intricacies of operating in those very complex environments. And no doubt we will continue to do that in the future. Again, as Representative Forbes pointed out, we are continuing to do that today with forces that have been significantly reduced from the days when we had something on the order of 400 to 500 ships in the inventory. We are doing that by, one, demanding a great deal of our operating forces today to operate not 6-month deployments, but perhaps 7, 8, or even 10-month deployments in the case of one of our recent major amphibious groups. So we're getting more out of our sailors at a great cost to them and to their families. We're also doing this with ships that are obviously require maintenance, but with maintenance resources that have been significantly reduced from what they were, say, 10 or even 20 years ago. That makes it much more difficult to keep those ships ready on a daily basis to go forward. If your spare parts inventory is only 50% of what it was before, obviously when you reach for the next thing in the bin, it may not be there. Thirdly, we have increased the missions that we ask of our ships. No longer is it necessarily only to control the seas, to be master and commander on the far side of the earth, but we may, in fact, be dealing in a complex environment where ballistic missile defenses for 4 or 5 countries are at issue, and that requires a particularly difficult kind of professional background and training that we need to be able to maintain over a period of time. This is difficult to do in an environment which, again, as Representative Forbes pointed out, cuts may be administered by willy-nilly as opposed to based on analysis or even understanding of what the causes are that we have to deal with. Now, in saying all this, my good friend Seth has advanced a few ideas in his book which should cause you to think. Do we need ships that are of this particular size? Do we need carriers that are of 100,000-ton displacement? I'm not going to argue those points, but because of what I think the basic issue is here is, should we think about these issues? Yes, we should. Should there be a greater dialogue about the place of maritime strategy and sea power than there is today? We badly need it. And so for those of you who write, who blog, who Twitter, and who indulge in all of those sophisticated social communications that are so important today, as I learn from my grandchildren and my children on a daily basis, get the word out. Let people know that this is something they need to think about, they need to read, and they need to be even a little bit excited about it, as excited as we are who have the privilege to go forward and represent our country and our nation and those places in the world where most people have never gone before. So thank you very much.
Right.
You're next.
I'll go next. Thanks, Admiral. And thank you, Seth. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here under the aegis of Seth Cropsey's latest book, because Seth Cropsey understands naval power. Seth Cropsey understands the consequences of the decline of naval power. And few of us really do. Few of us now understand the connection between not only naval power and national power, but naval supremacy and American power. And this really is, I think, the key issue that's facing us. I want to talk about the strategy of all of this. And I'm not going to propose what the strategy should be, although I think that if you do the work, that becomes fairly self-evident. But I want to talk about the process and, in fact, how that needs to be readdressed and re-wickered. But before then, I want to talk just a moment about what Admiral Marfiak just said about thinking about this. I don't think it's fair to say that people aren't thinking about this because of a conversation I had this weekend. I went up to my boarding school in Connecticut for a memorial service of a longtime faculty member, and I was talking to a man who had been a student there when I was. He wasn't in my class, but he was close. And he said in a conversation we were having, and you can imagine the conversation, I'm not going to tell you much about it, he said, well, maybe we should let somebody else try this. So people are thinking about this. Unfortunately, they're thinking all the wrong things. And the instincts of the country can no longer be counted on to reach the right conclusions. They can't be. Americans are not studying history. They don't understand how these things fit together. They're not joining the military. The professionalization of the military has cut out the national contribution to national defense. So this is a big problem. So let me talk about the strategy here for a minute. My sense of this, of the way this works, is that victory at the tactical level comes from doing the right things well. And success at the operational level comes from doing the right things. And that success at the strategic level, which is what I want to talk about, requires getting the big picture right. Things like, what sort of war are we facing? Who's it going to be with? How do our opponents think? What are his strengths and weaknesses? Where will the war take place? How long will it last? How must we organize to fight that war? What will we need to fight it? And how must we sustain the force? These are crucial strategic level questions. The Pentagon, however, is a building for processing money, not for thinking about these issues. The Navy staff is not thinking about these issues. The Navy is not thinking about these issues. And I exaggerate only slightly. In the interwar years, the U.S. Navy succeeded masterfully at this. There was a triangular relationship between the Navy staff, the Naval War College, and the fleet. The fleets were doing experiments, the Naval War College was doing wargaming, and the Navy staff was making sure that the fleet had what it wanted and needed and was feeding back into, and the fleet and the staff were feeding into the war games. By the time the interwar period was over, before World War II, the Navy was gaming 330 days a year at Newport, and 99% of the flag officers who served in World War II had passed through Newport. 99%. Nothing close to that is happening now. And the education that the naval officers are getting at Newport is a far cry from what's required, but that's another story and my neuralgia. That interwar period involved the hardest thing of all for an organization, a strategic planning organization, to do. The Navy talked itself out of what it thought the war was going to be like. The Navy, at the start of the interwar period, like all other navies, all other great navies, was thinking about the Battle of Trafalgar, the Battle of Tsushima, the Battle of Jutland. Okay? There was going to be, in that view, a climactic battle at sea. It was going to be a relatively short war. The fleets were going to come together, and then the victor was going to sail home to great glory. The Japanese, on the other hand, so the Navy rejected that notion. The Navy understood that war in the Pacific was going to be a long campaign. It had to have special measures taken to sustain it, and one of the most important things that came out of that interwar period were mobile dry docks, because the Navy understood it was going to have to take its sustenance and maintenance with it for these kinds of campaigns. The Japanese literally bet the farm on the former, which was the short, climactic blue water battle. It wasn't all battleships all the time, obviously. The Japanese had understood the power of aircraft carriers, but the point was they didn't provide for the kind of war that it was going to be, and they lost the farm. So getting the big picture right and recognizing and cultivating the interconnections among those parts of the big picture and with the other aspects of national power depends upon an exceptional planning, strategic planning exercise. I can tell you precisely when the Navy's strategic planning exercise started to fall apart. It was in June of 1990. Admiral Kelso was on the Hill. He was sitting before the Senate Armed Services Committee. It was his confirmation hearings as Chief of Naval Operations. And I remember it for two reasons. One, because John McCain was on the panel. And he said, "I'm John McCain. I'm from Arizona. Arizona is so dry that the trees chase the dogs." And everybody had a good laugh. And then he set up the Admiral with the most wonderful softball question I've ever heard. What do you think about the Maritime Strategy? And what Admiral Kelso said, because I was in the Maritime Strategy office at the time, that's why I was there, just chilled my heart. He said, "We don't need a maritime strategy." And the Navy didn't need to be told twice. This was the end of the Cold War. Why bother? And so the Navy actually, at that point, stopped bothering about a lot of things and has ended up as an unbalanced fleet. Things like anti-submarine warfare have really diminished. And that's an art as much as it is a skill. So that was when it started. Since then, instead of the Navy asking how much it could do and how much and where it could do it, the Navy has been asking in a very non-strategic way, in a budgetary way, how little it can do and what it can get away without doing. That's why our weapons stocks are so low, because generation after generation of planners has said, well, has been promoted on the basis of, well, we can do with just a little bit less, and look how much money we can save. Now, the reason that Seth Cropsey's book is so important is because it's the essence of good strategy. It asks the basic question, what is this thing about American naval supremacy? What does it buy us? Nobody's thinking about that because it's so part of the atmosphere. Nobody's talking about that on TV. Nobody's writing movies about that. And the Navy's not talking about it either. And the Navy, in my view, has lost the capacity to how to talk about it. You've heard others say this. I'll repeat it. Naval dominance, American naval dominance, is the foundation of our geostrategy. It has enabled the United States to establish the world order that we live by and enjoy. And that world order is based on the rule of law, American currency, American notions of free trade, and free access to the global commons. All of these things, every single one of those things I've just mentioned, is being challenged by China. If there were ever a time for a strategic planning enterprise, this is it. Because while we have been enjoying these advantages, but gotten so comfortable that we've forgotten the realities of challenges to them, the rest of the world has either prospered under them and stopped doing what they need to do to support us, or they've chafed under them, like the Chinese, and are planning to challenge what we're doing. So present circumstances, in my view, are very troubling. We have an unbalanced fleet with global responsibilities but no reserve, and it facing the prospect of sustained major combat operations against another Navy. It's been 25 years since the U.S. Navy has thought about that. There is absolutely no continuity with Cold War planning in this regard. My conclusion about all this is that the maritime strategy enterprise is in dangerous disrepair. In fact, no one is quite sure who's responsible for the maritime strategy. Successive chiefs of naval operations have either rejected the notion or accepted it only reluctantly, and this is both a consequence of Admiral Kelso's disclaimer and also combined with Goldwater Nichols, which has taken responsibility and put it other places. As a result, the debate over the kind of fleet we need to approach these challenges and deal with these challenges has not yet been joined to any significant degree. Most suggestions are more of the same, of doing less with less. And with a major challenge coming from China, that is simply not going to serve. On current trajectories, the default option is to no longer have a global Navy. And if you don't have a global Navy, you can't have global naval dominance, and then the game is up, in my view. Personally, I believe that Americans can achieve just about anything we set our minds to, but before we get to that point, we have to discipline ourselves to think through what the problem is and then what to do about it. We clearly didn't do that going into Iraq and Afghanistan, and you all know how that turned out. And now it's the Navy's turn. So this is not good news. I just wonder if Navy strategists have learned that lesson. So this is where the maritime strategy deficit is so damning, not just for the Navy, but for the nation, because there's no basis for action, no intellectual, virtually moral organizing principle to set objectives and guide actions. By contrast, in the late 1970s, Admiral Thomas Hayward, soon to be but not yet the CNO, he was the Pacific Fleet Commander at the time, faced the same sort of problem in the 1970s. We were in the middle of the post-Vietnam malaise. The Soviet threat was overwhelming our imaginations. The concentration on defense of Europe and warfighting there to the exclusion of anything else had taken over all of our planning. And the current, at that time, current strategy was to swing everything from the Pacific and send it to the Atlantic. And by the way, nobody then knew what they were going to do with it. Essentially, this was a devil take the hindmost strategy. And Admiral Hayward said, sitting in his headquarters in Makalapa at Pearl Harbor, he said, this is neither the way to use a Navy or to beat the Soviets. So what did he do? He developed what has become known as the Maritime Strategy of the 1980s, the last great maritime strategy. And this was an offensive, this took an offensive global posture. It escalated horizontally against the Soviets. It was a competitive strategy that fixed in place Soviet Far East forces so they couldn't reinforce the Central Front in Europe. There was an emphasis on fleet striking power where it could make a difference. There's a dominance in numbers of key competitions like ASW and anti-air warfare, power projection, command and control, and the quality of our personnel. It held the Red Navy at risk. It provided for effective fleet defense, and it ensured sustainability at sea. Now that is a strategy. And Admiral Hayward did it all on his own without anybody telling him from his position as a fleet commander. That evolution was a thing of beauty, and it was equal to anything that came out of World War II or the early parts of the Cold War. Now, my view is that we face the same kind of challenge from the Chinese that we did from the Soviets, except it's much more complicated because so many Americans depend upon good relations with China, no matter what the Chinese are planning. In my view, you've heard me say it before from this platform, we're already at war with the Chinese because they think we are. Finally, I want to take gentle exception with one of Seth Cropsey's conclusions. To remind you, in his book, he concluded that the U.S. has 4 large tasks. They are dividing the defense budget strategically, saving substantial funds by returning accountability and good management practices to what they need to be, increasing the size of the fleet through important changes in design and types of combatants, and thinking through and testing the ideas that are essential to assuring American victory in any confrontation with China's emerging military power. Where I take gentle exception is this business of dividing the defense budget that we have. The strategy that the Navy needs to come up with has to argue not only for that, but the strategy has to make the case for a larger budget. Because, in my view, we can't square the circle under these budgetary conditions, because not just because of the problems of the China threat, but because we're so far behind now, because we've been cutting and cutting and cutting for 25 years. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Paul. And there's another good reason for increased book sales, so that there's a second printing in which I can mend the errors of my ways that Paul has just pointed out. Brian?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to come back to Hudson. I hope you all got enough to eat. Could be here a while.
Make sure your mic is on.
Just kidding. How do I? Can you hear me?
Do you have you don't have a green light?
I have a green light.
Okay.
Oh, no, I don't.
Yeah, users.
How about that? Better.
It's a mistake to give Brian a microphone, by the way. So.
High tech.
It's great to be here. A big treat today. Representative Randy Forbes, who I've come to know over the past year and a half and admire, is going to be, in my view, the most consequential House member in decades when it comes to naval issues, probably since Carl Vinson. He gets the link, the Mahanian link, between national power, naval power, and geography better than almost any living person other than maybe Lieutenant Commander B.J. Armstrong, who's one of Mahan's biographers, who's here in the room today. He gets it. he gets it. And he also gets the essential problems. You know, the language in the NDAA for 14 that tells the Navy to come back next time and tell us what your fleet's going to look like with the money that you've historically been given is a wonderful poison pill that the Navy has to now swallow and figure out. I think that's a great thing. It's also a treat here to be with Tom Marfiak and Paul Giara. Truth be told, for most of my adult life, Tom Marfiak was either Sir or Admiral. But it's great to be here with one of the most clear-thinking and literate men to ever have commanded at sea. Paul Giara is a colleague and friend of long standing. I learn something from him every time I'm in his presence, and he is very obviously my style coach. Most exciting of all is I have the chance today to preach to the unwashed mass who has not yet purchased that fine book, Mayday, by Seth Cropsey. Both here in the room, there are some for sale outside, and over the internet, available through Amazon, which is where I got it. To kind of go over what Paul said, Seth Cropsey has forgotten more about seapower than most of us will ever know. He and I work very closely on the Romney campaign, on the Defense Working Group on naval issues, trying to put together the strategic rationale for the larger fleet that the governor wanted to build. It was truly an at the master's knee experience. The interaction back and forth between Seth, the emails, the corrections, the gentle corrections that came back my way, really taught me quite a bit, and for that I'm grateful. Enough wind up. Let's get to the pitch. Jim Holmes is a professor at the Naval War College, very smart guy. And when he reviewed Seth's book, he made a statement in the review that sea power is a conscious political choice. I can't agree more. But to the extent that anything conscious is happening with respect to sea power in this town, I bring you back again to Representative Forbes' remarks. The only product of any real thinking that I see is the annual 30-year shipbuilding plan, which is 80% fiction, and which is built on cost estimates that represent a kabuki between the Navy and the Congress that is almost embarrassing, in which the Navy underestimates the amount of cost, which is just fine with Congress because they don't want the sticker shock. The ships begin to get built. Everyone realizes, oh my goodness, we can't afford these ships. More money comes in. Everybody gets beaten up. Eventually the ships get built. Fewer than we would have liked, probably, but this is the essence of the acquisition kabuki. This 30-year shipbuilding plan doesn't happen after an in-depth strategic review. It doesn't look at what the strategy is and allocate resources accordingly. It is a math problem. OMB tells DOD, here's what you get. OSD Comptroller tells the Department of the Navy, here's your share. The Navy goes off and then spends its money the best way it can. This gets back again to what Mr. Forbes was saying about the paucity of strategic thinking. Again, sea power is a conscious choice, and it is a choice we are not making in this republic. We are in autopilot, to some extent ignoring growing threats, and continuing to rely on bureaucratic approaches to force structure and strategy that value consensus and collegiality above assigning and assessing coherent risks and thinking strategically. But why is this? This is really why Seth's book is important. Something has to have caused this place we are right now. Why would what is essentially an island nation with very friendly neighbors on all of its land borders, thousands of miles across broad oceans from most of its strategic and economic interests, why would it be sea blind? Why would it turn a blind eye to its most important strategic military capability? I have my theories. Paul pointed to Admiral Kelso's 1990 appearance before the Senate Armed Services Committee. This, incidentally, was 4 years after the miracle of Goldwater Nichols. I've done this before in print. I beat up
Here it comes.
Jointness before, yeah. And I'm going to do it again. The process of getting those unruly services under control, which began in 1947, reached its epitome, or its highest point in Goldwater Nichols. Don't get me wrong, jointness has some significant benefits. It's a great way to fight. The world envies our ability to bring the hurt with a number of different assets in synchronized warfare using land, sea, and air power together. It's also pretty good with respect to acquisition. I applaud efforts that attempt to force the services, where it makes sense, to use common things, common technology, common weapons and sensors. On a side note, I'm very excited about the move to a common camouflage uniform after watching this ridiculous proliferation of camouflage uniforms. I take it as a point of great honor that I never on active duty one time wore that silly blue uniform that the Navy has as a camouflage uniform now. But jointness is not a strategy, nor is it strategic. In modern understanding, jointness has come to be seen as a strategic end rather than a strategic way. And so when administrations, Democrat or Republican, attempt to create strategy that flows then down into military procurement decisions, lurking never far from the surface is the specter of jointness and its nefarious offspring, the fair share allocation of resources. People like to talk about a one-third, one-third, one-third split. That is not the way it is, and it hasn't been that way for a long time, which is because about a fifth of the budget gets skimmed off the top by OSD for its own purposes. So the other 80% is what gets split among the services. Since the end of the Vietnam War, we've had 6 or 7, pull your upper lip over the top of your head kind of strategic reviews in DOD. QDRs, scammers, you name it, whatever it is. Yet, magically, the Navy gets about 29% of the budget to share between the Navy and the Marine Corps. The Army gets about 25% of the budget. And the Air Force gets about 27% of the budget. No matter what strategy we pick, no matter what direction we head in. We're not making hard choices. And I think jointness, this collegiality, the military virtue of the highest order is consensus, is what has led to that. Obviously, during wartime, base budgets get increased with supplementals, and the Army has gotten quite a bit more than that 25% in the last 13 years. But the base budgets are pretty much stay that way. So I return you again to Professor Holmes. Seapower is a conscious political choice, one we're not making. Instead, we choose a balanced force, which in my opinion overinvests in land power and underinvests in sea power, and to some extent air power. And as the resources become scarcer and scarcer, we simply bake a smaller pie and then divide it up the same way. The result is that we can do essentially the same things, except in fewer places, to a lesser degree. This is the leading edge of decline, and this is why this book is important. It sounds an alarm. There's another contributor to the inability to think, I think, properly about sea power, and strategically about it, and it flows from what President Eisenhower referred to as the military-industrial complex. When Secretary Perry sat down with the heads of the 5 families in the early 1990s, had the CEOs of the biggest defense contractors together, he told them basically that there are too many of them, that they would need to consolidate because the Department of Defense could not continue to support so many people doing what they do. This spurred an era of consolidation, so that we created large defense contractors who look, surprise, surprise, like the Department of Defense. You got an executive vice president for land systems, an executive vice president for maritime systems, an EVP for ground system. There's no vested interest in that interest group in shuffling the deck. Their strategic plans for the next 10 years, when they sit down and write their strategic plan, is counting on the budget pie staying about the same way it is. It gets divided up essentially the same ways. So in the Pentagon, we have generals and admirals and senior civilians who aren't advocating for those things that their services do individually, uniquely, and irreplaceably. And in industry, we don't have corporations that are using their good offices and their relationships to do anything but support the status quo. This is a recipe, again, for malaise. There's an exciting development happened a few years ago, though, and that was the spinoff of Northrop Grumman Shipbuilding into Huntington Ingalls. And I thought, my goodness, we now have a major corporation with tens of thousands of people that is completely dependent on building warships. This has got to change things. I haven't seen that yet. I look forward to seeing more of a dialogue, a strategic dialogue on seapower that is sponsored by and that is supported by the companies in this country that are dependent on it. This isn't a mercantilist thing. This is what I believe is the smart play. I believe that it is in their interests to make the choice for the smart play, not the safe play. All right, at the end of my time, Seth, thank you for allowing me to be here and push a few rocks around of my own. You've provided me with a great example, and I had better get cracking on my own book. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their observations, their nice words. If there are questions, we'll be happy to take them. Please say who you are and to whom you are addressing the question, and then also include the question. Abe?
Thanks. Abe Shulsky here at Hudson. As a question, I guess, first of all, for Paul, but also for the other panelists. Your comment about Goldwater Nichols struck me as rather significant in this context, because if there is such a thing as sea power and a naval strategy as such, and then you look at the way in which our forces are in our Defense Department are structured, there's no real advocate for it. I mean, as you said, the Navy is in a sense out of the strategy business as the Navy because of Goldwater Nichols. And then you have a division among combatant commanders around the world, no one of which has a sort of global naval perspective. Perhaps PACOM comes closest, but even so, it's only part of the world's oceans, not in naval power all taken altogether. So I was just wondering what your proposals might be for fixing or changing this organizational structure so as to reflect the notion that there is such a thing as naval power that has to be looked at as a separate element of strategy, separate in a way from the command structure as it now exists.
Thanks, Abe. Well, the first thing is I think that Goldwater Nichols really confused the hell out of everybody, not least the Navy. And I think the reason that, well, I don't know the reason, but I presume that one of the reasons that Admiral Kelso said what he said was that service chiefs no longer felt that it was their responsibility to conduct these strategic planning efforts, and that was somebody else's job. However, that somebody else never seemed to get the message. The Joint Staff is not a general staff, so it hasn't been doing it. I say what I'm about to say advisedly because I was at OSD for 5 years, and I firmly and viscerally believe that there are some things that OSD absolutely has to do, but if it's not doing them, it better stop trying, and it's not taking care of strategy writ large as far as I'm concerned, let alone maritime strategy. And so this brings us back to the chief. There is a precedent for my proposal, and the precedent is that there are only 10 or 11 or 12 or 9 carrier battle groups to go around, depending upon the day and the year and the status of their maintenance and availability. And it became obvious that the COCOMs couldn't apportion those carriers, so without real signal, the Navy took back that responsibility. It seems to me that it makes perfect sense for the CNO to take back the responsibility for maritime strategy, and there are a couple of reasons. My rationale is severalfold. The first is that if there is still going to be a global Navy, well then one sort of centrally organized individual, one mind, if you will, although it's an institution, is going to have to speak to that global presence and those global purposes. If there are going to be several fleets, but not on a global basis, but in several regions, likewise, it's unlikely that those several COCOMs are going to be able to sort this out, and likewise, this should be a Chief of Naval Operations responsibility. If there's only going to be one fleet, let's say it's going to be in the Asia Pacific, PACOM just simply hasn't stepped up to the bar, and it's completely unlikely, in my view, that it ever will. It's not organized, it's not doing these things, and if there's any organization that's in worse shape than those in Washington, it's PACOM for strategic planning. You're welcome, Admiral. I'd be happy to talk with you about it. So I think all roads lead to the feet of the Chief of Naval Operations. But this is going to require its own change of mind, because I don't think the CNOs think that this is their responsibility. But I think it is. I think it better be, and I think they can do this.
Let me, Paul, can I add a couple of words here? Just like very few people who have read the Affordable Care Act, very few people have actually read their way through all of the intricacies of the Goldwater-Nichols legislation, which is a considerable body of data. However, a couple of things. One, what it effectively did was it assigned, as Paul noted, the chiefs of services a Title X responsibility to provide the forces for the coordinated commanders, the COCOMs. I was part of the team that worked on the last great maritime strategy. One of the first things we did was we took all of the then sinks, before Don Rumsfeld changed the terminology, we took all of their requirements and added them up. And it added up to something on the order of 25 or 30 carrier battle group equivalents. Obviously insupportable, not about to happen. And so the question is the allocation of scarce resources, which is what strategy is in part all about. How do we decide to use the resources we have in a meaningful way? And so that's where the COCOMs came in. But somebody has to make the overall allocation. And right now, given the limitations of the carrier battle groups we have, available air wings, resource overhauls, or refueling overhauls rather, some of which have been delayed, the question is whether or not going forward we'll be able to maintain that capability. Another aspect of Goldwater-Nichols was that it mandated for each one of us that in order to go to command of a ship, you had to have a qualifying tour, and there were only certain billets that qualified, something called the JDAL, the Joint Duty Assignment List. If you hadn't been assigned to one of those billets, you were ipso facto not qualified for command, notwithstanding your years of experience at sea beforehand. If you want to get the attention of the naval community, you tell them you're going to go to command, but you're not. You make those determinations. You got 16 years invested in the service, too bad for you. Right? So everybody got on board very quickly and trying to understand how you work through this legislation to get the qualifications so you could go to command. Are all of those billets necessarily going to build the right strategic thinkers? Are they going to promote the people who are the most innovative in terms of coming up with concepts for the future? You can argue those issues both ways, but it certainly had a major impact, and I think continues to have a major impact. We did a study at CSIS with Goldwater Nichols Part 2, going forward to try to figure out what the long-term implications of this would be. So you can read those reports over at CSIS. But it's still an abiding issue as we go forward. Certainly operating jointly is a necessity today because we, for example, the Navy does not have sufficient tankers, the Air Force does. The Army or the service that has a long-term build it on the ground capability. The Marine Corps goes in, it's a quick reaction force, but it's not designed to be there for 10 or 15 years on the ground. And so each of the service brings something unique. And then, of course, we have to fold in our allies. But as Paul and Brian already mentioned, they don't always budget for or build the kind of forces that will be necessarily compatible in terms of the force structure, training, professionalism with the Navy, with the forces that we put forward. So there's many different pieces to this pie going forward. But the important thing is that we have to start thinking strategically. We have to start acting in terms of the long-term requirements of this country. Thank you. Question?
Here, please.
Otto Kreischer, Seapower Magazine, Leatherneck, Semper Fi, former enlisted Marine Navy officer. I want to challenge the assumption or the argument that the naval services haven't been in the strategy business. You know, about 5-6 years ago, the CNO, the Commandant, and the Coast Guard Commandant came up with the National Maritime Strategy, which puts out, has the naval forces doing all the things that that you suggested they would need. And now in the post Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan era, they're already pushing the transition to the Pacific and trying to build air-sea battle concept to counter the A2AD projection by China. You know, whatever limits they may have under Goldwater Nichols and OSD, it seems that at least the naval commanders or naval forces commanders are making an attempt at doing a strategy.
Well, I'd like to turn that question over to Ryan for a comment, but I cannot resist noting that the Ford Motor Company was in the business of making cars when it produced the Edsel. But Brian, could you carry on?
I don't quite know how to take that. But, Otto, you're right. And as I was listening to these gentlemen, I was sitting here thinking, Jesus, did I waste 1.5 years of my life writing a maritime strategy in 2006, 2007? A couple of things. What you don't understand, weren't privy to, was the withering criticism we got within the building that this wasn't our job. CNOs don't do this. Service chiefs don't do this. Service chiefs write budgets. Okay? So all I will tell you is that first Admiral Mullen and then Admiral Ruffett were sailing upstream against a lot of resistance to what we were doing at the time. But they went through with it. We created what is commonly known as the second great maritime strategy, since obviously it's nowhere near as good as the one from the 80s. What I will tell you is that they are in the midst now with the bench that they have of revising that strategy. So, I think you're right to some degree. But this monstrous animal that is the joint staff and its twins or its offspring around the world has sucked from the services a lot of the talent that goes into strategic thinking, ops, plans, policy, strategy, largely because of this sense that, hey, OpNav, you build budgets. That's what you do. You don't do strategy. So, we get a lot of great people at OpNav, but the combatant commander staffs is where it's at if you're going to do pole mill stuff. And You know, the Navy staff gets what it can. Thanks.
Please.
Good afternoon. Excuse me. My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I've been teaching in China for the past 10 years. And I'm very much a layman when it comes to the subject we're discussing this afternoon, but very interested in it. One, my impression as a layman, and I hope you'll excuse dumb questions, is that the United States is dominant by a very large margin on the sea right now. And is that in fact the case, and what does the future project? And two, could you expand a little bit more on what you perceive as the threat from China?
Number one, the first question, the United States Navy is dominant. In my view, if we were to fight China tomorrow in a naval battle, we're talking about a 3 or 4 week war, Navy on Navy. But we don't fight that way anymore, right? But that's not the question. The question is, how much naval power can we allocate to the Pacific? They don't have to be bigger and stronger than our entire Navy. They just have to be stronger than what we can put there. Ultimately, their ability to contest our ability to act with freedom in the Pacific. This is the anti-access area denial threats that you may have heard about. That is what is, I think, the most pressing military need that we have to face. If we are able to more successfully and confidently operate inside of their missile and submarine envelope specifically, our naval preponderance will stretch out for decades to come. But we have to solve that problem. We have to solve the problem of being able to operate safely in there. That was the first question.
Go ahead, Admiral.
No. Operating in the Pacific is a much different prospect from operating in other parts of the world. I've been in the South Sea of Japan with a Japanese ship on one side and a Korean ship on the other side, conducting joint, simultaneous, bilateral, but separate operations because they don't communicate. So it's arriving in one particular area and saying, we're here, we've got it covered, we'll take it from here. It's requires a great deal of diplomacy up front. First of all, I hope we never come to the point of a conflict with the PLAN because there's too much at stake in terms of the economies, the diplomacy, and the future of both countries. But it is a military question, as Brian has noted, not of what the preponderance of the force is, but what we can bring to bear at any given moment. You know, a great deal has been made of the Asian pivot. And so our friends in Asia look very carefully to see, well, what does that mean? What has the United States moved? Well, so far we've moved a couple of littoral combat ships to Singapore, and we may bring some more forces to bear in Western Australia. In the long term, we plan to move some ships from the Atlantic side to the Pacific side, but there does not seem to be at this point a major eye-grabbing shift of forces that's going to make the U.S. presence in the Pacific area necessarily that much greater, that much sooner. And so it's a question of, as they watch us move, as they watch us exercise, and they watch us very carefully, and obviously we know they're watching us in terms of cryptography and code breaking and all the rest of that on a daily basis, that we continue to make the moves that are credible, that are backed up with a professional force that will be determinant as if it were to come to that. These are issues that are played up not in some scholarly journal, not in the back pages of some publication by the International Institute of Strategic Studies, but on a daily basis on bridges across the South China Sea where the Chinese ships and the Japanese ships and the Vietnamese ships and the Philippine ships operate side by side. And so we are sometimes moments away from a flashpoint that you nor I will have primary responsibility for determining. And so it is needful for us to have this presence forward that we've talked about today, so that we can be there not 3 weeks after the event, but we can be there to prevent it from happening. This is called deterrence at sea, and it is, I think, a capability that requires us being there in the first place in order for us to be effective. Paul?
Thanks for raising the issue of China. I'm not going to give my normal spiel about, you've heard some of it already about China, but dominance, naval dominance, depends upon reputation. And the best way to figure out your reputation is to determine what other people think about you, not what you think about you. And I think what's going on in the Asia-Pacific vis-a-vis China is, first, the Chinese figure that we're gone. We're going fast. That the nation will not support the effort required to stand up to the Chinese, and that the Chinese can, with some effort, but nevertheless reasonably, push us out. So that's the Chinese assessment of us. But that's important, but it's not sufficient to figure out really what our reputation is. It needs to be taken very seriously, but it's not sufficient. You need to go to Tokyo and Seoul and Kuala Lumpur and Manila and Hanoi and ask those nations what they think of us. And the way they think of us is determined as much as anything by the way the Chinese think of us. Because they're watching the Chinese very carefully. And part of their assessment, part of our allies and friends' assessment of us is coming from watching the Chinese and figuring out, calibrating what the Chinese view of us is. So it's sort of a twofold, two-level game. Then the rhetoric emerging from Washington doesn't sound so good. It doesn't. So I've spent a lot of time with the Japanese, and not least the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force is a good friend of the U.S. Navy. But you know what? The JMSDF is a thinking, living, breathing mechanism. And the admirals, present and retired, who are running the Maritime Self-Defense Force are wondering, will we be there? Will we be there? Can we do it? And this becomes particularly complex when, because we don't have this compelling organizing strategy, we don't have a series of requirements that we've assessed we can't fill, and then ask the Japanese to fill them. And they understand this silence. They understand what that means, and it's not good. So I don't think you can answer the kind of question that you raised in this city. You have to go out to Asia to answer it, and that's primarily where it's going to be answered. But then ask the Turks. Ask the Turks about naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean. See what they say. Because there is no American naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean. There isn't. A commander of American naval forces in Europe some time ago said, he was the commander of the Sixth Fleet. He said, why do we need a Sixth Fleet? Why do we need a Navy in the Mediterranean? The Russians will never be back. Really? That's interesting. And so he cut his staff by 2/3, and the only time you see an American ship in the Mediterranean is just very episodically, almost by accident, passing through. And so what are those countries thinking about our future? Ask them.
We have time for one more question, and we'll go as far back in the room as I can see a hand raised.
Seth. And then take his question behind the guy with the mustache, because he's had his hand up.
Okay, fine.
The Orient
right.
guy.
Two questions.
We'll do two.
My name is Eric Labs. I work for the Congressional Budget Office. I'd like to sort of take us away from strategy for a second and go to the underpinnings of resources. You gentlemen, all four, are navalists in the belief in sort of a strong and powerful Navy. And I was wondering, and to the extent, Seth, that you have addressed this in your book, forgive me, I haven't read it yet, but to what extent under this world of the Budget Control Act, do you see the level of resources required to support the Navy that you envision of being able to carry out the strategy that you envision? And likewise, what level of resources that is, regardless of what level of resources that might be, is the Navy buying the things today that you think that the Navy ought to be buying when you look to the future?
Wow, great question. First of all, it presupposes that we have a white board up here and we can write everything that we would like on one side, and then we can move the budget things around so that we can fund all of those issues. Part of it is the Navy building everything that we think it needs today? We can argue, and many have, that we're not, that the F-35 is too expensive by many analyses. That the LCS is as yet unproven. The two versions are still coming online, and they are just now being introduced to the fleet. There are many questions we don't know the answers to, in terms of how effective the modules will be, where we'll be based, et cetera. So we're looking at those kinds of issues. We're looking at amphibious issues as to what size amphibious force do we need, how does it interface with the Marine Corps, what other missions is it going to have. So there's I think the service chief, both the commandant and the chief of naval operations are looking at those kinds of questions. Now, as Paul and Seth, Brian already mentioned, a good portion of the defense budget goes for non-service related issues. DOD, I think, occupies, when all the DOD-related agencies, which there are many and multiplying, occupy about 22% or so, 23% of the budget, and that comes off the top. And of course, the services don't have the means to reclama that and say, we think it ought to be 17, Mr. Secretary. It doesn't work that way. So that money seems to be coming off the top as a cost of doing business, and that leaves a certain amount of, the remaining amount to be allocated between the services. One of the things about the great maritime strategy of the 80s was that it actually moved budget share. I know because my service strategic friends said, boy, how did you guys do it? You actually moved, I think it was 2 or 3% of the budget. Now, it was like a bounce in a political campaign. It didn't last forever. But it did make a significant difference over a period of 3 or 4 or 5 years. And so, the question is, notwithstanding the objectives, the obstacles that the service chiefs face, if they were to make that case, if that were something that would become freely talked about and not just the subject of a 60-second interjection on the floor, as Representative Forbes talked about, but a really substantive discussion, would it represent, perhaps an opportunity to change the things. Yes, we are navalists, but I think we are something more than that. I think that the essence of this discussion is about whether the United States in its strategic vision of the future, what should we hope for, what should we try to accomplish in the days and the years going forward? Are we fundamentally a humanitarian nation? We continue to do humanitarian operations. Disaster relief, yes, that's very good. But at the end, if it comes down to that, we must, as the Constitution says, have a Navy that can defend this country forward. How do we do that? Where do we come up with the forces and the people to be able to do that? Because it's not just a simple matter of sending a press gang down the pier and say, you come with me, we're going to sea. It may take us 10 or 15 years to train somebody to man those councils. When I took my Chinese and Soviet colleagues aboard the carriers, they would say, well, this guy here sitting on this council, he must be an officer. I said, no, he's a second-class petty officer. Oh, no, you put him in uniform, enlisted uniform, and he's really an officer. We know, because that's the way they run their services. But we don't. We take kids off the farm. They were putting a new engine in their Chevy truck last month, and now we make them responsible for running an F-18 on a carrier deck. That's the magic of the system. But we don't do it overnight. It takes particular dedication and professionalism over a period of time to be able to do that. So that's one of the issues. We're fighting for not only the ships to be able to do that, but the people. It always comes down to the people, the sailors and the Marines who serve. So this is a debate that will go on, but I think, and I applaud this gathering today because at least we're asking the questions. We don't have all the answers, but we are at least talking about it, and that's, I think, a very important move forward.
I would say that doing the right thing requires buying the right thing, and there have been a couple of key junctures where the Navy hasn't anticipated what that right thing is, or failed to achieve it. One of the things that I think is going on is, if you don't mind my saying so, the carrier Navy is sort of having a crisis of identity. It's not quite sure where it's headed, and that's because when the A-12 program failed, the carrier Navy lost its long-range strike capability. I mean, really long range, beyond the unrefueled range of the F-A-18. F-35 is not going to change that. The XB-47 and its U-class follow-on might, but that set the Navy back a long way. And part of it was because nobody anticipated the requirement for that going forward. Another problem that the Navy is facing now, I don't know that it's missed it, but this is a real problem for the Navy that will determine where its money gets spent, is the proliferation of precision-guided munitions delivered by all sorts of different modalities. What this does is, for our Navy, is it levels the playing field where we had tremendous unilateral advantages in the past. We're not going to have those now, and this is another reason why it's so much harder to defend the fleet. I believe that the strategic planning enterprise and the important parts of it have to sort these issues out. This is one of the areas for net assessment, for instance, which has been key to some of our signal successes in the past.
Eric, I don't believe that we spend an insufficient amount of money on national defense. I have no data to back that up. My gut feeling is $600 billion or whatever it is plenty. However, because it is misallocated in this fair share way, we wind up oversubscribing to underutilized and unnecessary capabilities. You ask about the Budget Control Act. My sense is that if the top line of the Department of Defense, and you please correct me, if the top line of the Department of Defense were maintained, the department would, below the BCA triggers, the department could write a budget however it felt. And so that to me says that if the department got its act together and sat down and actually tried to do some strategic thinking and then allocated those resources in a strategic way rather than in a cookie cutter way, the BCA would be a non-issue. Okay? Secondly, you asked, are we buying the right things? Yeah, in the Navy. I'm not a fan of the Flight 3 guided missile destroyer. I think it is the technical risks associated with trying to squeeze the kind of radar into it that the Navy wishes to squeeze into it outweigh the benefit of serial production of incredibly capable Flight 2A Arleigh Burke destroyers. We should be building Arleigh Burke destroyers like F-16s because we can build them cheaply and serially. And as Bob Work will tell you after our many arguments, I'm worried about numbers. We do need more ships. We need more powerful ships. This discussion of the pivot to Asia, if you look at the ships the difference in the ships that'll be there in 20 years, it's 4 DDGs and 5 amphibs, or 4 DDGs, 4 amphibs, and a JHSV. There are no additional DDGs. There are no additional SSNs, which brings me to my final where we're not spending enough. And that is our most important competitive advantage against anybody else in the world is our ability to fight from underneath the water. We should be doubling down on it. We should be putting as many weapons as we possibly can into the submarine environment. We should build more SSNs. The Pacific is huge. 48 SSNs means when you really, really need it, you maybe get 25 or 26 when they start pulling guys out of the yards because the others are frankly not saleable because of their maintenance cycles. I think ultimately the more We can put undersea large diameter UUVs. You could build 50 LDUUVs for the cost of one SSN. The things that you can do with large diameter UUVs are just eye-watering. The weapons. We approach the Chinese with one hand tied behind our back, and that is from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which they don't subscribe to, right? So they're threatening our aircraft carriers with conventional ballistic missiles that fly in the range of missiles we are not permitted to field. I would like to look at that treaty very closely. I would like to look at conventional ballistic missiles in our attack submarines. Conventional ballistic missiles that are not dependent on satellites for their guidance system, inertial navigation. Comparatively speaking, the Chinese underinvest in anti-submarine warfare and ballistic missile defense. I want to make them spend more on both.
What was the question? There was one other question.
We have one more question.
Right there with his hand up. Let me follow up on that just for, no, go, never mind, go ahead. Yep, that's right.
Well, thank you all very much for this event on naval sea power. I'm Jeffrey Lynn. I'm a researcher with Senator Angus King's office, the Defense Senator from Maine. And my question, again, thank you very much to this panel, has to do with the sort of state of our industrial base, because ever since Robert McNamara started closing things down to the 1960s, our naval shipyard building capability has declined to the point that we now rely on 2 shipyards to build all our DDGs, and 1 shipyard to build our nuclear submarines, another one to build our aircraft carriers. So I'm just wondering, as the sort of level of shipbuilding declines, if Representative Forbes' forecast about staying on autopilot, so to speak, holds, that what implications that would be for our shipbuilding base, and obviously if we lose, say, Bath Iron Works or Huntington Ingalls Industries, it's pretty much impossible to replace if and when we do need to get it back. Thank you.
I'll take a swing at it. In World War II, we had one of the largest shipbuilding industries in the world. We had a navy of around 6,000 ships, and we had ships being built in factories in Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, backwaters all over the place, as well as the major naval shipyards and so on. We have been, in a sense, in a retreat since those days of a long consolidation process that goes back far beyond Mr. McNamara's efforts to consolidate. There have been many benefits from consolidation. Shipyards have learned how to work more efficiently. We've learned new ways to lay out and cut steel and to cooperate to build different components of the ships. We've learned how to build through modules so that we can cut the time that it takes to build a ship, even a large carrier, by building various units which are loaded and then assembled, and so bypassing much of the work that has to go into building the complex subsystems of a ship. Having said that, the United States continues to outsource its industrialization. There are many parts of ships and many other things that we use today on a daily basis that are built for us in Germany and Austria and Switzerland and Malaysia and so on, and then brought in. To go, look at the sticker on your car and see how many components were built overseas. Right? Same thing for ships. But are we at the irreducible minimum? And that's the question. You suggest, I think, we have 1 shipbuilder for carriers, 1 or 2 for submarines, a limited number of people with the capability of building a complex surface combatants. To build an LCS, or a joint high-speed vessel, which is basically a high-speed ferry, has 1 set of requirements, 1 set of skills. But to build an Arleigh Burke Flight 2A or Flight 2B, or indeed a Flight 3, is a completely different, much more integrated in terms of complexity of combat systems. And that's where you get the people, the interface between the industry and the professional that is necessary to build those kinds of ships going forward. That's really hard to maintain that. Right? But we have, in addition to that, and this goes far beyond the Navy, far beyond the shipbuilding industry, and that is, how do we maintain people in this country who have the education and the skills and the work ethic to be able to work on those kinds of things? You've heard of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, a program to try to get people in our schools to study those disciplines so they can graduate and do something else besides flip burgers or, make coffee. But in terms of the application to shipbuilding and engineering complexities, we have to have people in place for a long period of time. And what the industry is facing today is as people retire, you reach back, where do you get the next person to fill that shift? And what we're seeing, and what Seth documents in his book so well, is sometimes this doesn't work the way we plan. We have to go back and do work over that was done the first time. Or there is instability in the shipbuilding contract process, so people say, well, we're going to have to let go 15,000 people. And as my colleagues in industry have told me, well, you let those 15,000 people go, you turn around and 6 months later you want to rehire them, they've moved into different professions. They've gone different places, so you're not going to get the same degree of expertise back that you had before. Right? So that's one part of the problem.
And this...
15 seconds?
Go ahead.
My friend, seapower is all about making political choices. I look forward to Senator King making a series of very good political choices. And I look forward to hearing all about Senator King's efforts to bring some of his friends along with him in these good political choices.
Right. Good move.
Thank you.
Yeah, and your question also, in conclusion here, goes back to what Randy Forbes was talking about in an unfunded future fleet, because that lack of funding means fewer ships, and fewer ships means fewer people needed to build them, and that has the sort of spiraling downwards effect that cannot be compensated for overnight or even in 10 years. So you reach, I hope we don't, but the possibility is that we reach a certain point where recovery is, the magnitude of recovery is so great that it's excluded from real world possibilities. You have a real crisis, has to be answered today, not 15 years. Oh, I'll take care of it in 15 years. That's not the way this business works. Look, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and especially our panelists for their contributions, and Congressman Forbes in his absence, and we look forward to more events as we stand up the Hudson Center for American Sea Power, and hope to see you at them. Thank you very much.